Hi, my name is Biz, and I am a passionate advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's my life's work, and I'm not really sure how I got here. There's 3 things you need to know about me. The first is that I am a lifelong Cubs fan, which means I am a diehard optimist fueled by never-ending hope. I root for the underdog, and being a Cubs fan has made it possible for me to give a significant amount of my time towards change I may never see come to fruition in my lifetime. The second thing you need to know about me is that I grew up with a great deal of privilege. I belonged to a country club, I went to boarding school, went to a small liberal arts college, and while I had many friends of color throughout my childhood, I was not aware of how differently they had to navigate those spaces, how often their belongingness was threatened. And I mistakenly universalized my experience as their experience. I didn't have the language then. While my parents and older siblings engaged in philanthropy and volunteering, my dinner table was not where I learned to talk about systemic racism, power, privilege, equity, or microaggressions. You know microaggressions, right? Those everyday slights that make us feel shut out. The can I touch your hair and my hand's already in it. The what are you? Do you speak English? Are these kids real siblings? They're these everyday reminders that make us feel less than. The average middle school student of color hears 291 microaggressions in 90 days. And the consequences are devastating. They lead to eating disorders, binge drinking, cutting, suicide. Now that I'm a parent, I want to build fluency in my children to understand the world around them. How many of you are parents? How many of you had parents that talked about race, gender, LGBT issues, folks that are differently abled, in an open and positive way? Seems about right. Look, I'm a white parent raising white children, and I want to acknowledge that parents of color have to navigate these conversations with a different lens. And while my wife and I have been together for 18 years, which does give me some insight as to what it's like to prepare my children for a world that doesn't always embrace them, there's a lot of whiteness and privilege in my world. There's an important statistic. Over 50% of white parents have never talked to their children about race. Over half. So for those of us that are trying to talk about race and difference with our children, we're trying to do something we have never seen. Now, that third thing you need to know about me is that I had awesome birthdays growing up. You'd be jealous about my bike parade party, my costume party, the come as your favorite Smurf party, where all the girls came as Smurfette and I came as Hefty, but that's an entirely different TED Talk. Right? I now make a huge deal about my kids' birthdays, and that is all my mother. That's what's in my archives. But when it comes to talking about race, many of us have nothing in our archives. And the fact that our archives are empty shapes the way we talk, or rather don't talk, to our children about race. We shush our 4-year-old when they declare that all black men are garbage men. And when our 2nd grader says it's unfair that Billy gets extra math help at school, we don't take that opportunity to expand their understanding of fairness. And when our 6th grader, we refer to them as white and they tell us we're racist, we just shake our heads and walk away. We do this because we are not brave. We're afraid of leaving our comfort zones. We're afraid we're going to say the wrong thing. As a parent and an educator, I have realized that we have to build capacity in our young children to navigate the topics of race and difference in the world around them. But in order to do that, to raise kids that are color conscious and color brave, we adults need to be brave, but we need some tools. So many of us have decided we needed to upgrade the knowledge from our parents on lots of things. When it comes to race, most of us are walking around with a pager at best. Can we at least upgrade to a flip phone, people? Right? And we got to cut ourselves some slack. We may not have everything figured out. I don't have everything figured out, but that is not permission to give up. We need to engage in these conversations, okay? Because we can only reject a software update for so long before it starts making our lives harder. And pretending you are colorblind and that your kids are too young to talk about race is a really old operating system. And it's going to make all of our lives harder in the long run. So what are some things that we need to think about? First stop, I would say bias. How many of you have heard someone say, I don't have a bias bone in my body? I'm so sorry you have no bones. We all have bias. It is the narrative we fill in about all the people around us. But it so often goes unchallenged that we don't even notice it's there. I think the best way to recognize bias in ourselves is to pay attention to surprise. Right? You look at me, lots of words come to mind. Triathlete is probably not one of them. And yet I had 3 kids under 2 years old. I love my kids, but I did everything I could to run away from them. I did a sprint triathlon, I did a half marathon, I did a 200-mile relay race, and I ran every block of every street in my town. But you look at somebody in my body type and you may think that I'm lazy or unathletic. Pay attention to surprise. It lets us know we had some assumptions that aren't matching with people's experience. The second thing we need to do when talking to our children is separate our stuff from our kids' stuff. When my son was 2, he referred to every man he met as daddy. My friend who was visiting from college, the neighbor, the landscaper down the street, everybody was called daddy. And at first we were concerned that because he had 2 moms, he was feeling left out for not having a daddy. And then we realized every man he knew was somebody's father. And he didn't hear them referred to as Jeff or Chris or John. He heard them called daddy. He wasn't longing for a father figure. He just thought that was every dude's name. So when my daughter was 3, I'm driving the car and she says, "Mommy, I love white people." Because I just really love the white man. And I'm thinking about how to have an age-appropriate conversation with her about this when it hits me. I said, "Honey, do you mean the white guy that's on the street sign that says it's okay for you to cross the street?" She goes, "Yep, I love that white guy." This stuff is loaded for us. It is not loaded for them. And we have to understand the context and make sure we understand the question. The third thing we do is we think our kids are too young or that we want them to be innocent of these things. They aren't. Okay, and I assure you that if you are trying to keep your kids innocent of racial inequality or systemic racism, you're probably white. Kids of color are not afforded that same opportunity to wait to learn these lessons. And they're often treated like they are much older than they are. We need to think about how do we make sure we're brave in every moment. And we have to be kind to ourselves when we think that our kids are too young. I've worked in higher education for a long time. And at first, I was trying to understand why it was so hard to talk about race and difference with college students. And I realized it's because they have to do so much unpacking and unlearning. For many of them, their worldview has never been questioned, and it can be traumatic, particularly for white students who have not been forced to do so before. And so after working at universities for a long time, I started working with high schools, and then I started working with middle schools, and then I had a baby, and 18 months later we had twins, and now I work with preschools. Kids are never too young to develop racial literacy. So we need to get rid of this failed experiment called colorblindness. We have decided as a culture that noticing difference is a huge problem. Noticing difference is cognitively inevitable. And it's not the noticing that's the problem. It's the ascribing meaning to that difference. I see your race, and therefore I think you are less than. That's what we need to change. We've spent way too much energy on the wrong part of this equation. Let's talk about privilege a little bit. If I walk down a hallway that has 9 open doors, I'm unlikely to even realize I walked through a door, much less that there were 9 of them. Yet if a friend comes to me and tells me that when they walked down the hall, 4 of the doors were shut and 2 of the doors were locked, I might struggle if my understanding of privilege has me universalizing my experience as the experience. When they start to tell me what happened to them, I say, no, you just walked down the hall. You must be doing it wrong. Right? I start to blame that person for the obstacles that are in front of them. Or maybe I don't even believe them when they're talking about it. Maybe I think that everybody is given the benefit of the doubt like I am, rather than wrestling with the reality that some people are dealing with the deficit of the doubt every day. And what happens with that is it has us all thinking there's one singular experience, that we're all sitting around the table looking at the same thing. But based on where you're sitting, some of us are seeing an M, some of us are seeing a W, some of us are seeing a 3, and some of us are seeing an E. Yet we'll battle. We'll say, how dare you? It's so clearly an M. How can you think it's a W? We need to have one singular truth. And that idea that we all have the same experience has caused us to have some significant systemic issues that we're not dealing with. that are keeping us from being a truly equitable, free, and just society. Because it has me not questioning mass incarceration and private prisons, and instead being comfortable with a system that targets people of color and fills our jails for profit. Our schools should be a place where we have a positive and sustained school climate, where every student feels safe and welcomed and valued and respected, rather than us using punishment to push out kids of color. And wouldn't it be great if everybody could just be who they were, rather than us praising kids who are consistent with gender expectations and punishing and bullying the kids whose gender identities and gender expression do not fit our restrictive standards. Maybe then we'd stop wasting energy trying to keep transgender kids out of the bathrooms where they feel safe. And the list goes on, right? Muslims, immigrants. Anytime a group starts to fight for their dignity, for their respect, for equality, we struggle because we live in a hierarchical culture. And there is no such thing as equal in hierarchy. And so when a group starts asking for the same things, we start seeing them as dominant and trying to take over. So let's go back to those earlier examples. Your 4-year-old comes and declares all black men are garbage men. What we need to do in that moment is say, no, honey, that black man is a garbage man, but there are garbage men that are not black, and there are black men that are not garbage men. And maybe we'll use some examples like the principal from their school to talk about it. And when our 2nd grader comes and says it's unfair that Billy gets extra help at math, we need to help expand their understanding of fairness. That we're looking at fairness of outcome, not sameness in process. And that if my child doesn't get math help because they're already successful in math, and another kid gets what they need, nothing at all is being done to my child. It's not pie. There's enough for everyone. And when our 6th grader comes to us and we say that they're white and they refer to us as racist, we need to help them understand the difference between bias and discrimination and racism, and talk about how racism requires institutional power to enact discriminatory and prejudiced beliefs. We need to explain that talking about racism isn't racist, it's vital and it's healthy. But we think our kids are too young. So my wife and I went to see the movie Selma, and when we came home, we talked to our kids about the film. And we said, when you don't have rights, you have to fight for your rights. And when someone else doesn't have rights, you need to stand with them and fight for their rights. And we talked about how when they were born, we didn't have marriage rights, but our family and our friends stood with us to make sure our family would be protected. And our kids were 4 and 5, got in this beautiful discussion where my daughter turned to my son and said, I'd fight for your right to suck your thumb. And he said, I'd fight for my right to suck my thumb too. And then he turned to her and said, I'd fight for your right to wear bow ties. And they turned to their other sister and said, I'd fight for your right to wear princess dresses. They weren't too young. They could understand what it meant to be kind and to stand up for others. And it's a few years later, and we can build on those conversations. We have a Black Lives Matter sign in our yard, and my white children are not walking around thinking, my life doesn't matter. Black lives matter more. We've been able to give them examples of how black lives are not treated equally, and then they can see why we need to stand up for those things. And if we don't have those conversations with our kids, there will be nothing in their archives. So we need some ground rules on how we do it. The first is to recognize that you all get to be imperfect in this process. My 8-year-old should not be able to understand race and difference at the same level I do at 41. They're going to make some mistakes. Do your best to navigate those conversations, but let everybody make some mistakes in their learning. The second thing we want to do is teach our kids to pay attention to surprise. What a vital tool it is for us to understand our own bias. The third, we want to strive for brave space. I assure you that somebody in this audience, if not all of you, are going to have a teenager someday that says the thing that you said or did was racist, sexist, or homophobic. And they might be right. And what you do in that moment will speak volumes in terms of how they should handle those situations. Will you minimize and blame and deny? Or will you be open to feedback and critique and be willing to expand the way you operate? We spend too much time focusing on the messenger in our culture. We lose the message. I didn't like her tone. I didn't like her. She was too close to me. Her passion, her tears, all of that stuff is irrelevant, and it's a way to distract from responsibility. We need to teach our kids when somebody comes to them and says, you hurt me with this microaggression, that they listen and apologize, not tell that person that they're being oversensitive or that they can't take a joke. We want to teach our kids to be upstanders, right? That stand up for people who are being targeted and treat everyone with kindness and respect. We want to teach our kids that humor is funniest when everybody's in on the joke, not when it's used to have somebody feel left out or less than. That's not being funny. That's being mean. And we need to call our kids into a conversation about all these things, not call them out for their mistakes. We want to teach our children how to hold other people accountable without demeaning them or tearing them down. You got to be patient. Remember when we used to think the sex talk was a one-time thing? Right? That we could cover all of healthy sexual decision-making and consent and reproductive choice and sexuality and all of these things just one time. We now know that that has to be a developmentally appropriate, ongoing conversation. And the same is true for race and difference. So I want you to take a second and think about what would it be like if we did this? What kind of changes would our world have if all of us were building this competency and this capacity in our children from the very beginning? If we skipped all that unlearning and unpacking. First of all, I think that the adults would be transformed by this process. It would open us up in ways that we can't anticipate because we would be doing so much learning along with our kids. It would not be a one-way street. We'd be learning from them, and they would be powerful teachers. And I think that the impact of having these conversations with our children could be immeasurable in terms of what it does for our world. Imagine if we sent our kids to school and didn't just teach them to stop bullying, but taught them how to create a school where everyone felt safe and could reach their fullest potential. What if our kids, the ones we're talking to about these things, and understand the value of others and understand the obstacles that some of their peers experience based on their identity, infiltrated our workplaces and got rid of diversity programs that were just about optics and demanded a truly inclusive workspace where everybody was valued and it focused on innovation and positive morale? And what if our kids became corporate leaders and political representatives that refuse to create policies that target people for who they are, but instead created policies that all of us would be comfortable being on either side because they were policies that were rooted in eliminating injustice, creating opportunity, and harnessing the great potential all of us have to impact our communities and our world? This is the world I'm working towards. I hope you'll join me. All of our kids deserve better. We may not get there tomorrow, but we will never get there if all of us don't do everything in our power to make it a reality. Now, I warned you. Cubs fan. Diehard optimist. Fueled by never-ending hope. And by the way, the Cubs won. Thank you.